This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson, and once again we have with us tonight Dr. Buck Melton, who has, for the good of the world, decided not to become president. And you're now here with us in Macon, Georgia, Buck. And did I overstate that?
The world will never know what a favor I have done it by refusing to run.
Okay, a lot of political figures have not been so restrained as you have. May I say that? Well, we have a lot of things we've talked about, and I know that you have an enormous legal background, a professor in the legal world, and there's a recent Supreme Court decision that has an impact locally in regards to sports gambling. And obviously in this part of the world, people follow different athletic teams very carefully, and many of them have chosen to bet in the past. And they're on the outcome of their different kinds of athletic contests. And there have been limitations on that, and the Supreme Court has recently said, okay, all that's off, and maybe you can discuss what the reasoning was and what that means.
Yes, it's actually a fairly simple exercise in federalism, and the court was fairly unified. There were one or two dissenting votes on this. I suppose to start with it, rather than starting with gambling, we need to start with the idea of federalism, the idea that we began as a number of separate colonies and then jointly declared our independence from England. And the question from the beginning was always, where is the ultimate sovereignty? Is it with the individual former colony? Is it with the individual state? Or is it with the national government, the United States as a whole?
Or was it with the people? But well, that's another matter.
That's a huge can of worms that I'm not going to touch
that,
tonight.
Right,
yes, I personally believe that the people is a construct that does not exist. But
that's another thing to discuss. Yes.
So one of the two elements that was hardwired into the Constitution to make sure that no government exercised too much power was a division of power between the national government and the state governments. And in one area, the state government would reign supreme, and in the other area, the national government would reign supreme. And in around 20, 30 years ago, Congress passed a law essentially telling states that they could not get involved in the business of gambling. And just a few years ago, I think around 2011, 2012, the state of New Jersey decided that it wanted to get into the business of gambling, wanted to expand the business of gambling beyond the casino sort of thing that you had in Atlantic City. And at that point, I believe it was the NCAA that got in and said, no, you can't do that under federal law. And so the case went to the Supreme Court. It actually went a couple of times before the courts. And just recently, a few days ago, the Supreme Court has said, no, Congress overstepped its authority and does not have the authority under our federal system, this division of power, to tell states that they cannot have gambling within their borders.
Well, what about abortions?
Well, that's different. That goes back to individual rights. And I agree with you. The distinction that the court would make there would be what you might broadly call property rights or money versus personal rights or civil liberties. And for better or for worse, the courts have decided that two different standards apply in those two different areas. And abortion is, according to the court, as personal as it gets.
Well, so what the courts do, if I can understand their process, is they sort of, in a way, manufacture, rights by extracting some verbiage in the Constitution. They manufacture rights of one type or another, and then they balance those manufactured rights, if you want to say it that way, against another set of rights that are in the Constitution, and then they say one is superior to the other, or they try and parse out how the collision between those two ideologies can be reduced. Is that fair or not, or am I overstating what the courts do? It does seem tricky.
I would quibble a little bit with your wording, because if you're going from it from a legal basis, it might be, particularly the word manufacturing. I think some judges would argue that they are discovering rights, so it's a loaded term, the term of a cynic, which one that I frankly happen to agree with.
Yes.
So, but speaking as a purist, I don't know. In this case, the court, it's a fairly straightforward exercise. It's not really so much about the rights of individuals. This is the right of the state itself. If you bring up something like abortion, or for that matter, freedom of expression or freedom of the press, these things would be more individualized rights, and so the analytical framework would be a little bit different. Even so, the court still could be very hypocritical, in my view.
All right, well, I'll continue this legal discussion, although I'm certainly not equipped to have it, but I'll throw you some softballs. Well, how about marijuana? So in other words, if the court, and there's a collision right that exists now for states' rights, I think I believe California says, well, you can have marijuana. I think that's a fair statement, and there are federal laws against it. Does the same logic apply? That this is a states' right issue for marijuana?
Well, once again, and it is kind of technical. If you're talking about marijuana, you're talking about an individual's right to do something, and here it's a matter of the state. The situation here is where the federal government has attempted to tell the state that it can or cannot. There's an intermediate step here based on the analytical framework that the court has put together. I agree with you. It's a chimera that ultimately you're talking about individual rights. I'm simply telling you that the analytical framework that the court has adopted in this particular case is it's not even looking at the individual. It's simply looking at the dance between the federal government and the state government. Now, if Congress had passed a law saying that the states cannot tell individuals that they cannot use marijuana, then that would bring it within the analytical framework of this case. It's a really hyper-technical sort of case in this situation.
Well, it does. I mean, I guess what I'm getting at, in a way, it's unusual to hear the federal court try and grant any privileges to the states. I mean, it's really quite a thing, isn't it? I mean, they've been centralizing power and expanding the purview of the federal government for some enormous, at least a century, I would say that, with occasional dips in the process. And so it's a bit unusual. Now, I'm continuing to throw you these little zingers, if I can say that. What about sanctuary cities? So does the federal government have the, and it's a complicated story too, about it's not as if all laws don't exist within city limits. It's just some states, I believe one of them is California, has said, per the same logic in regards to states' rights, well, we're not going to prevent the federal government from catching illegal immigrants, but we won't aid them.
Yeah, this is also a states' rights issue. You're absolutely right about that. But once again, the analytical framework that the court has put together is somewhat different. In this case, in the sanctuary city case, the question is, can the federal government either force state and local authorities to enforce federal law, or can they somehow prevent state and federal authorities from taking a tack that is different from what the feds want? So once again, slightly different situation here. I would say in that case, the sanctuary cities thing, the states probably have some basis there for saying, no, we're not going to do this.
Okay, well, just to continue on this conundrum about checks and balances, a federalist system, what about communities? So in other words, if in fact you're a county in California and you say, in our county, we're going to collaborate or cooperate with the federal government, and it happens to be against state law, but you're going to put a local, I guess, ordinance in place that says this is the way it is. Could the state, could the state actually launch criminal charges against people that were attempting to cooperate with the feds? Could the state interpose themselves in this interchange?
Slightly different arrangement there, because the relationship of a county or a local or municipal government to the state is not the same as the relationship of the state government to the federal government, in that all local governments, be they county governments or administrative units, city governments, authorities, anything like that, are essentially the creatures of the states or of that particular state. Where, for instance, the Georgia General Assembly could theoretically meet today and pass a law abolishing Bibb County and just have the area that Bibb County consists of absorbed into Monroe County or Jones County or whatever. That is not something that Congress can do to the states. So,
well, what about prohibitions in state constitutions? Mm-hmm. In other words, if you say, well, I'm unaware of the constitutions of different states. Mm-hmm. But could sort of where I'm selling the ship is into chaos. Mm-hmm. So if you have these frictions between the different governmental entities, mm-hmm. how that's resolved could be quite complicated. And if one entity is diametrically opposed to another, the laws are different. Then presumably one entity trumps the other one. Yes. Pretty much that's the situation.
Yes. If you've got a situation where clearly one of the entities can't do something, then it should be a fairly easy matter for the Supreme Court to say, well, either the state or the federal government's completely out of bounds. And that's essentially what they did in this recent gambling decision. If you've got a situation where both the state and the federal government have some constitutional basis for getting involved in it, then that is normally resolved by the Supremacy Clause, which says that if there's a genuine real conflict, that the national government is going to trump the state government situation. Now, if you want to add an additional layer to it, though, then you add fundamental rights, which is where abortion comes into it, which is where federalism and everything else fall before the fundamental rights, and they're going to say that the states can't do that, even if it looks like they can, because now you're talking about an individual's fundamental right. There's no fundamental right to gambling. I'm trying to think
about that phrase in the Constitution. I mean, I'm searching
fundamental
for it.
Right? Keep searching. Keep searching. Let me know when you find it.
All right. Well, now, just to continue on this subject, there is enormous centrifugal forces in the country. I mean, I think as observers of this, we could say it's more than ever. I've made the analogy of Spain in the 1930s. We're sort of in Andalusia, and you could say if once you get to Boston, you're in Catalonia there, or shall we say in Sacramento, you're in California. So the individual political constructs are in some ways at war with one another, and in a subtle sense of the word. And it's very inflammatory. The idea of sanctuary cities out there, and it's as a starter, it's quite an explosive term to say sanctuary. Mm-hmm. It would imply that I think in the Middle Ages, the idea is you were in a ethical, moral place. You went into the church. Then secular authority could not go there, and so at least the way this thing's constructed is that there's sort of I guess people at mercy of the secular state that are being mistreated, and once those mistreated people find a moral city to reside in, that city will protect them against the arbitrary, reach of the federal laws. And what does the Supreme Court have to say about that? I mean, has such a case come to the Supreme Court? Are things headed in that direction?
Yeah, this is actually nothing new under the sun. This tension between national and state governments goes all the way back to the beginning. Probably the best example in our early history would be personal liberty laws passed by states such as Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. When in response to the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1790. Constitutionally, Congress had the power to pass this law, and it said essentially that and without using the word slave, of course, that's gauche, but if a slave escaped into a free state, he's still a slave, and the free states would have to make provision to send the slave back into the ownership of his master. And the northern states said, well, okay, we'll do that, but we're going to create a lot of hoops that any master or slave catcher is going to have to jump through. We're going to have a hearing. We're going to have to give the alleged slave due process. We're going to give him the chance to call witnesses, to put on evidence to show that these aren't the droids you're looking for. I'm not really a slave. You know, there's no photography. There are no fingerprints. And so this is very much the sort of thinking with sanctuary cities. The sanctuary cities are saying, look, we can't get Congress to repeal immigration law, but there is nothing in the Constitution that forces us to use state and local law enforcement to enforce that federal law. That's up to the feds. If the feds want this law, they can enforce it themselves. So nothing really new, this tension between national and state, between the idea of community values that may be out of step with other communities or may be particular to that region versus some sort of national community, if you will, has always been there.
Well, I mentioned the fugitive slave law. The way the ultimate resolution between this clash of viewpoints was the Civil War. So if you have the viewpoints are quite strong, or the difference is quite strong. So you could say there are going to be some places in the United States where people that are of different national origins are going to be protected. We'll do everything we can to protect them, and we'll give them certain kind of rights, whatever rights, and indeed the largesse of the taxpayers. We'll do something to help those people, and we'll do all kinds of things to make sure they're not sent back every way we possibly can do it. When the census takes place, we'll try and arrange a census arrangements where they would not feel encumbered. We'll give people access to public education, and a number of privileges are granted, and it seems to be quite an issue, particularly because their descendants were going to be U.S. citizens, and it gets into really a complicated demographic event taking place, encouraged by the fact that the demographic enclaves in different places are in many ways communities that have a tricky kind of a viewpoint about national allegiance. A lot of dual citizens, a very, very complicated arrangement.
Yes, and one can get rights from a state constitution or from state law, and one can also get rights under federal law or directly from the federal constitution. So, it's quite possible for a state to extend certain rights or certain privileges or liberties to individuals that are not recognized by federal law or by the federal constitution. As a matter of fact, in a lot of ways, we forgot that for a long time, starting with the big Eastern and Central European immigration in the late 1800s. This idea of different ethnicities coming in and racial hatreds and ethnic hatreds and various prejudices shown really even before that to the Irish was an impetus for the federal government starting to push a sort of national homogenized view of the Bill of Rights on the entire country. So local standards could not be prejudicial towards the newcomers. But in doing that, we forgot that the states could also grant more rights than the national government. It was not until Supreme Court Justice William Brennan around 1976 wrote a very famous article saying, hey, states have constitutions and bills of rights too, that we started focusing on what states could do in excess of the federal government in terms of protecting various individuals or groups. So it's once again, the national or the local.
Well, I go back to my comment about manufacturing. So it does appear that the courts tend, obviously they're not going to like that phrase, but it does appear they often manufacture privileges and rights and responsibilities and duties that are not obvious. I would say it that way, not obvious.
It's interesting because, at the time of the Declaration of Independence and the time of the writing of the Constitution, and look at Jefferson's language in the Declaration of Independence, natural rights. And the idea is that these rights are objective, they exist beyond any human control, like the law of gravity. And in the last 50 or 60 years, the legal community has gotten away from that. And they say, no, it's really just whatever rights we come up with. But there are some rights that the legal community, or at least the Supreme Court, values over and above other rights, and they call these fundamental rights. And these fundamental rights I like to think of, and once again, I'm being cynical here, fundamental rights are rights that pretend to be natural rights. We create them, but they are so important we're not going to mess with them. And once again, that's the difference between abortion and gambling. Abortion comes under very important personal privacy rights that are really at the top of the heap. That there is a constitutional right to control your own body. There is no constitutional right to gamble, because that's simply just not as important a right. It's not a fundamental right. Now, why should one be fundamental and why should one not be fundamental? You can ask the Supremes about that.
Well, I won't get too complicated on that. I mean, how you control your own body is another matter. If there are people that have typhoid, they were required to do whatever. You have tuberculosis, you're required to go into, or at least you used to be, into a sanitarium. There are different ways that restrictions occur.
What if
particularly if you're going to injure another person, and you could say, well, the same way that we put somebody in a sanatorium that has tuberculosis, yes, that might spread or whatever, typhoid Mary, you can't. We're going to put you somewhere because you're injuring other people.
You're a disease vector.
Of course, abortion. You have the issue that you're going to injure another person.
And that's the crux of the issue. Is the fetus a constitutional and legal person? And the Supreme Court has repeatedly answered no to that. If it answered yes, then you'd get an entirely different outcome.
And I don't want to sail the ship too far, we'll swing back to normality in a bit, but you could say, well, if our conscious beings, do they have certain rights? And that's even appeared in some venues. Yeah, well, we have I don't know, the rights of chimpanzees, or they're pretty intelligent creatures. I don't want to push this too far. Dolphins have huge brains. I don't know if you're a conscious being, or you're going to do so. The court's they're in this manufacturing process. Could they not manufacture whatever? And just to go through this, they could easily manufacture rights for fetuses. I mean, in my opinion, if you want to say manufacture, but there's no obvious comment about that. And they could say, well, if you wanted to change the decision, you could say, well, new evidence appears that allows me to change that other viewpoint, in that I'm picking EEGs up or something, whatever. I mean, I'm getting evidence that there's a conscious being there, and from that you could then sail the ship wherever you wanted to sail it, and maybe the next millennium the court might well do something like that. But they seem to be in the business of trying to parse these things out.
Well, what you speak of is the difference between activism and restraint, and activism is when a judge essentially draws the line and then plots the points. That he starts out by saying, what should the outcome be in this case? And then he justifies it by whatever legal hoops he wants to jump through. Whereas a judge, and that's not a liberal thing or a conservative thing. There are activist liberal judges and there are activist conservative judges. If you listen to Fox News, you get the idea that activists are always liberal. That's not at all the case. Yes. A judge who shows self-restraint tries very hard to understand what the language in the law or the Constitution says, what it means. He tries to divorce his own background, his own personal opinions, and his own policy predilections from that. Now, can you ever do that 100%? Probably not. But he says, this is what the law is, regardless of what I want the outcome to be. The best indication that I know that shows a judge is exercising self-restraint is that he does not like where his logic leads him. He does not like the result in the case. but he feels bound to decide that way anyway. That's the reason why activism is so seductive, because you always get the result you want. And that's,
and you have your law clerks there to help you do it.
Yes.
I mean, you could just tell the clerks, I want to decide that I don't want these 10 million, quote, illegal immigrants sent out of the country. It's too disruptive. Find a way to keep them here. Do something. Go in there, get me some kind of arcane way to do it. And good, I'll sign on to it.
Yes.
I don't doubt, just in a cynical point of view, that the conversation I just enumerated occasionally takes place.
Not the least, absolutely. And it doesn't even have to be arcane. That it takes millions of dollars, if we're talking just the Supreme Court, it takes millions of dollars to litigate the average case to the Supreme Court. And each side is not going to spend that kind of money unless it thinks it's got a darned good chance of winning. So the court doesn't hear cases unless they could go either way, or not usually.
Well, finally, just to go into this issue, I mean, I sort of made the case, well, what's going to be the best thing for the country? I'm a judge. What's the best thing for the country? And let's forget whatever the deal is, or the way that it's coming down. What's the best thing for my ethnic group, or whatever group I'm here to represent in this pluralistic world? And I'm here to represent some, I guess you could say, before the Civil War, Southern judges were looking like that. They were saying, well, I have to respect the property rights of whatever, South Carolina, or whatever Southern state. I mean, I'm here, the primary thing on my mind is protecting those property rights, ergo I'm going to support any decision, the Dred Scott decision, I'll do that. And then in other circumstances, the courts would at least in some ways do what they thought was best for the country in a way, regardless of the legal deal. And I think about Obamacare. I think about the court decision that came out of that. The idea was this is such a contentious issue, even though it would appear the logic is obviously against the continuing the Obama health care law. The way that it's put, the way that it was constructed in this haphazard way did violate certain legal tenets, but nevertheless, if the thought seeming to be, or the justification seemed to be, well, if the court undoes this, it'll cause great, friction. The court's power will be diminished. There'll be all kinds of trouble. It's much better to let the democratic process deal with this issue. Thinking like that, is that the sort of thinking that exists at a high level?
Do judges think that way? Yes. Should they think that way? I think as a general rule, no. If you're going to start your analysis by asking what's best for the country, then you ought to resign your judicial position and run for Congress, because that's not the job of a judge. The job of the judge is to interpret the law and to apply the law. Now, it's not always a clean-cut situation. Sometimes you have to make a policy decision. But if you're always letting your policies always decide your outcomes, that's not judging, that's legislating, and you're in the wrong branch.
Well, Bucky, I think we've sort of run out of time. It's been a very stimulating conversation as usual. I'll have to brood about your wisdom.
Wisdom. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.